Moderator will unmute you in the Q&A session, the sections of the meeting, but you're free to use the chat throughout, and we will be monitoring the chat. And if there's a question that seems directed towards one of the speakers and makes sense to jump in with that question, we'll do that in the meat of the session, and then otherwise there will be a Q&A period after each panel within the session. So thank you again for joining, and I'd like to just kick it right off. Our first speaker is my chief, Astra Bonini. She's from the Integrated Policy Analysis Branch of DSDG in DESA, and she's going to sort of frame the discussion with some information on the background of the GSDR, and then we'll go from there. So Astra, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and it's really great to be here and to see so many faces. And really, I just want to comment that it's a pleasure to see this session being the result of UN coordinated efforts to bring a systems-based approach to the SDGs. It's really great for DESA to be organizing this together with the UN Development Coordination Office, UNDP, and UNITAR. And it's a testament to this integrated approach of the SDGs, but also working across the UN system to try to make this happen, because all parts of the system bring a different perspective and different types of work. So I'm just going to quickly give a little bit of information about the background of the GSDR. We have several of the scientists who've written the two reports here with us today, and they will go into more detail on the content and the messaging and the framing provided by the report. And then we'll have many examples of how it's being used in practice. But just to step back a little bit and indicate that the GSDR it's a mandated report. It was requested by member states to be an assessment of assessments that brings together state-of-the-art knowledge. Its purpose is really to strengthen the science policy interface by providing the evidence and drawing from science about the SDGs across disciplines, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, bringing that together in one place so that policymakers can draw from this as they try to implement policies that will tackle the SDGs and really accelerate progress. It had its origins in Rio Plus 20, which took place in 2012. The mandate was further strengthened, and there were several pilot reports that took place in 2014, 2015, 2016. But it was in 2016 that member states decided they would really like this to be written by a group of scientists, independent from the United Nations, but appointed by the Secretary General to really reach outside to the science community and get guidance and hear from the science community on what the research is saying about the SDGs. So it's a diverse group. The scientists are drawn from all regions, from many different disciplines, and it really brings a multidisciplinary approach to the SDGs that's crucial for understanding how all of these goals work together. The 2019 GSDR then was the first report that was written by a group of scientists, and it was launched at the SDG Summit in 2019. And that report really brought into the conversation the systems approach very centrally and pointed to specific areas where goals are highly interlinked and actions can be taken that are strategic and really have this multiplier effect that we know needs to be happening if decision makers are going to achieve 17 goals and so many targets simultaneously. So the 2019 report really brought that into the center of the conversation, talking about trade-offs and pointing out where strong co-benefits could take place between health and nutrition or gender equality, and looking at how all of the pillars of sustainability are represented in these systems that would be the approach to take. The 2023 GSDR And I would just also like to congratulate the scientists who wrote that report, because it took place during COVID. And the report itself is very reflective of the circumstances in the world at the time the report was written, because the scientists had to work through that process. They took forward the strong messaging on interlinkages that came out in the 2019 report, but also benefited from a bit of a surge in research on the SDGs and on interlinkages. And the report then is able to bring that body of work together with some new messages that draw from research that took place after 2019. So it really is a continuation of the conversation, and almost a real-time reporting back on what is happening in the science community around the SDGs and all of the latest research. The 2023 report also really focused on how to strengthen the science policy interface. And in that regard, there is a chapter that looks at this, but I would also comment that the process of the report itself is a tool for strengthening the science policy interface, because the scientists, yes, there are 15, they represent many different disciplines, but that alone is not sufficient to cover all of the research that's happening. So they really reached out through regional consultations to hear from the scientific community in different regions and get some feedback through the process on the report. And also, it was a peer-reviewed report. So there were over 100 scientists who did a peer review of an early version. So in that sense, it kept the conversation going for the 4 years between reports in terms of giving that kind of feedback from the science community. I'm gonna stop here, because I know that Shirin is coming next. She's from the 2023 report and will really have a lot to say about the messaging. But just to say, I look forward to all of the insights from the group that's here today on how to use the GSDR to drive transformation and what messages it has that can really help us in these final 6 years toward 2030. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astra. That was an excellent foundation for the discussions, and really very clear, and I think framed things nicely. So thanks so much. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Shirin Malikpour, who is an associate professor at Monash University, and as Astra mentioned, a member of the 2023 Independent Group of Scientists, the author group for the GSDR. So Shirin, over to you.
Thanks, Steph, for that introduction, and thanks, Astra, for really setting the context and introducing the report, actually both reports that have been produced in the past 5-6 years. So for this section of the session today, I've been asked to talk about some of the key frameworks that we have worked with, both as part of the 2019 GSDR, but also the 2023 GSDR. And these frameworks are really the basis of our thinking. They really shaped our thinking and also form the basis for a lot of our recommendations in both reports. And we really believe that these frameworks could also be very useful for policymakers and decision makers in the way they think and in the way they do strategic planning about SDG transformations. So I will share my screen, because these frameworks are also very visual, so I think they will really benefit from some visual prompts as well. I will share my screen with a few slides that I have. Can everyone see my screen? Excellent. Okay.
Yes.
So when we really started as a group of scientists working on the 2023 GSDR, one of the key themes that was really emerging from a lot of our deliberations was around acceleration, that we really need to accelerate progress on the SDGs. All the data and evidence that we had by then, and we even have to date, were showing us and are still really showing us that on the current trends, none of the SDGs are going to be achieved by 2030 globally. And actually, the scenario modeling work that has been done on the SDGs based on current trends also show that they will not even be achieved by 2050. So it is very clear that the kind of business as usual trajectories are just not going to cut it, and we really need to turn the dial. So acceleration was a key theme that was coming up over and over again in a lot of our conversations. But then the question was quickly shifted to now, what is acceleration? How do we accelerate, and how is it different to other forms of action that we have been undertaking so far? And this is where a lot of the frameworks that I just talked about become useful. So the 2019 GSTR really produced this framework of entry points and levers. And this is where we also started working on in the 2023 GSTR. What this really does is that through the introduction of entry points, it tries to really harness the key synergies that exist across different systems that underlie the SDGs. So say food systems, energy systems. These are really the underlying systems of the SDGs and really help to reduce, I would say, or simplify in a way, the complexity of the 17 SDGs in a set of entry points or systems that are more tangible for a lot of policymakers. Although in reality, a lot of these systems are also working in silos. So what it does also, it does by talking about them as entry points, it also tries to say that we really need to break down those policy silos and decision-making silos and really harness the synergies that exist across these different systems. It also talks about levers for change, and levers for change are things like governance, economy and finance, individual and collective action, science and technology. And in this GSTR, in the current GSTR, we also added another lever called capacity building. These are really about the means of implementation and the way we can actually go about thinking about interventions and actions that can help drive transformations in those systems. They also highlight the different complementary roles that different societal actors can play in the transformation process. For example, the role for policymakers, governments, the role for businesses, the role for civil society and individuals to really drive those transformations. And as I said, capacity building was then added by the 2023 group of scientists as a key lever for really underlying a lot of the other actions that happen across all the other levers. In thinking about transformations, we also thought about the process of transformation. So from a temporal perspective, what the process looks like when we talk about the transformation process. A lot of historical analysis, particularly in the field of technology diffusion, has showed that transformation processes often take the shape of an S-curve. So in the first phase of transformation, the first part of the S, you really have emergence. And this is where sustainable technologies, sustainable practices, sustainable behaviors might start to emerge. But they're usually in niches, so really small scale here and there. And over time, these niches can actually gain momentum, and they might reach a tipping point beyond which they can accelerate. They can be widely adopted. They can be really diffusing into the society and becoming, over time, stabilized or the new normal. So they become a new practice or a new way of thinking, doing, and organizing for the society. This S-curve really helps us in thinking about where we are at in the transformation process in any given system at any point in time and in any context. And then what do we need to do in order to move to the next phase? So if we are in an emergence phase, what do we do to actually move to the acceleration phase? And in the report, we talk about a whole range of interventions that can help us move upwards on that curve and get from an emergence phase, for example, to an acceleration phase. In the report, we also say and really emphasize that a lot of the rise of these sustainable practices, technologies, and innovations is also often mirrored by a decline in the unsustainable ones. And it is not always enough to just really work on those innovations and try to accelerate progress on those innovations without targeting the decline of unsustainable practices. To give a tangible example on that, it is not always enough to really think about just how to support, for example, the adoption of renewables. We need to be also thinking very effectively about how to phase out fossil fuels. Or if you think about, for example, the adoption of electric vehicles, for example, we also need to be thinking about how to phase out the other older types of vehicles that we have been using so far. So really, in terms of implications of this for decision makers, it is that interventions need to enable both the rise of the green curve, but also the decline in the red curve here. And then finally, again, one of the issues that we tackled in the report is that those the S curve and the decline curve, they're often discussed in the literature and in the scientific community as changes in one single system. Whereas when we talk about the SDGs, we're actually talking about transformations across multiple systems at the same time. So perhaps we need to be thinking about it more in this helix form, really. And there is a concept, again, in the scientific community called deep transitions. And it is often referring to changes in multiple systems around the same time in a way that these changes and transformations can actually propagate and impact other systems. So by harnessing the synergies in these multiple transformations that are occurring across different systems, we can actually change really the directionality of these systems over some extended periods of times and really achieve a holistic or a deep transition or transformation. So I'll stop here. These are really the key frameworks that I think in the subsequent sessions we will really get into the nitty-gritty and then what it means really in terms of the more tangible recommendations and what we need to do with this thinking. But I wanted to just mention that these are the kind of conceptual frameworks that really form the basis of a lot of those recommendations and hopefully actions that we might see on the ground. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shirin. That was excellent. As you say, we will dive a little bit more deeply into these frameworks throughout the session, but it's a really great overview and the visuals were very helpful. And I think it really, your examples of the fossil fuel transformation, electric vehicles, others, those are the kinds of things that we will discuss a little bit more as we go forward. But thank you so much for that very clear and comprehensive introduction. Now it's my pleasure to pass the floor over to my co-moderator, Mr. Jürgen Gafke, who's Senior Program Management Officer, also in our division, DSDG in DESA, and Jürgen's going to take us through the next session. So Jürgen, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Now the next session we are looking at how the lessons of the GSDR, how system thinking can be integrated into national planning processes. Just to my person, I'm working together with Stephanie in the same division for Sustainable Development Goals here in DESA, and I'm particularly looking at national and subnational planning processes. How can we integrate system thinking? How can we bring transformations and transitions into national as well as local planning processes, integrating particularly with national planning commissions, planning authorities, as well as local governments. Now, we are going through a set of speakers first. I saw there were some questions, but we may be going towards the end of the session, but maybe first the floor to Dr. Saidou Hamadou from Cameroon. That's the Ministry of Planning. And we are looking forward to hear the experience of Cameroon, how to integrate system thinking into the national planning processes. Dr. Saidou Hamadou, the floor is yours.
Thank you for giving us the floor. With the support, with the Professor Lundu support, we are working on some we are doing some work, as you can see in the slide. We scheduled this year many activities to train to train our local national team on some tools and methodology and model to follow to perform the follow-up of our main objective. You can see here there are some activities about theoretical training, but also training about methodology and practical training. We have also some challenge about data that we will see how to address it. But this years we will focus on the education sector, and what we need here is see how to implement what we call the follow-up very strategic in English. I don't know how to talk about, but it is see how to implement the IDG on education and how to follow it very well. We will have also some activities on communication and others. To do it, we have a roadmap. You hear me? We have a roadmap, as you can see. We start with we start science March 2024 with consultation. And then now we are working on the theoretical approach to see how in our site in Cameroon we can implement very well these activities. And since June, we are working on methodology, which method we have to use to implement very well the approach. And then from July to September, we will see how to apply there's theory and method that we learn in the reality context. And then we will end with some training. Our aim is our objective is train a mean trainer. So and there's people that we will train the other people, and like this we think that we can reach our objective. I will let Professor Elundu to complete this step. Thank you.
Yes, I will just give a little bit of context. I think out of the many things that the GSDRs, and especially the second one, accomplished was the notion of not just a transformation and systems approach, but also capacity building. In order to accelerate transformation, there's a need to have local, national capacity for analysis and prospective analysis. Countries have to be opportunistic in their plannings. In other words, they have to be able to ride current trends. They have to be vigilant and anticipate a crisis that are emerging and responding to this crisis. And they also have to be forward-looking, imagine sort of future scenarios and be prepared to capitalize on future scenarios. And so I was very, very happy to meet Dr. Saidu and his team, because he managed to carve out some resources from his ministry to build that capacity. And so what we are showing here is an example of some of the training that is scheduled throughout the entire monitoring, forecasting, prospective analysis, and it's going to be an activity for an entire year. And we are going to lean a little bit on Cornell University, and I reached out to Stephanie. We are going to try to stay as close as possible to the UN system to learn from whatever other teams in other countries do. Just 1 minute to say one final thing. The previous speaker spoke, Dr. Saidu talked about the education sector. It's actually education post-employment and inserting youth in the labor market in adult life. We are applying the X curve of transformation to transform a system of youth planning from, fly as you go, to a system where youth are going to be in a position to plan their careers, their lives, their retirement, their investment, and so forth more systematically. And so there's going to be a component starting in the end of high school through the phase of employment search and through the early career stages. And so this is something that we can discuss to a greater length a little bit later. Thank you.
Please, if I can have 1 minute to add something, just something, to give the context. As you know, here in Cameroon, we are implementing the National Development Strategic that we call SND 30, and this document contains all the strategic priorities that we define, and it integrates all the ADG, the 17 ADG that Agenda 2030, and the objective of this document is to conduct a sustainable development with a focus on structural transformation of our economy. And to do this, we have to see which ADG, which objective, which aspect of the Agenda 2030 we have to accelerate, and we have to focus on which target to reach our objective at the end of 2030. And for this, we think that we have to anticipate, as Professor said, to anticipate on some aspect to provoke some development aspect. That's why we need to a building capacity about perspective and order as you can note in our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saidu and Professor Parfait Elundou. I also see Mr. Josue Pilong joined just now. Am I correct? Would you like to add something to this presentation?
Josue?
Josue?
Is he still connected?
Oh, okay. I thought I saw him before.
Yeah, he was, but the network is very unstable.
Okay. Anyhow, thank you so much, Dr. Saidu. If that concludes the presentation, then let's move on to the next speaker. Now, from Cameroon, we are moving forward to Finland, and I'm happy to welcome Ms. Taru Savonen, the Deputy Secretary General for the Commission on Sustainable Development in the Office of the Prime Minister of Finland. And I'm looking forward to hear of the experiences, how to integrate system thinking approaches into national planning in Finland. The floor is yours, Ms. Savonen.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, depending on the time zones. I'm super happy to be here, and like I said, I'm Taru Savonen from the Finnish Prime Minister's Office, and luckily my presentation is followed by my wise colleague Eva Furman's one, so if I say something wrong, I'm sure that Eva will then, in that case, correct me. But I have a few slides to share, so I will try to get them visible. visible now. Is this now working okay?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, excellent. So what I wanted to talk about is the Building Finland's, and particularly the Finnish National Commission's strategy for 2022 to 2030, along the lines of the recommendations of the GSDR 2019 edition particularly. And to say a few words first about the Finnish National Commission on Sustainable Development, to understand what kind of body and what kind of strategy we're talking about, is that, like I said, we have this whole of society type of body in Finland that tries to enhance the implementation of sustainable development and currently the Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals. And it has worked already since 1993. Most of the terms, it has been chaired by the Prime Minister. The Commission works in 4-year periods and is always appointed by the Prime Minister's office. Now we just have a brand new commission started in February 2024, where we have the Prime Minister Petteri Orpo as the chairperson and then vice chairs coming from the Commission's membership and the Agenda 2030 Youth Group, which is a youth expert body that supports the work of the Commission and has done so since 2017 already. And this we have found a very fruitful way to kind of reform the chairmanship of the chairpersonship of the Commission. In the Commission's membership, we have around 110 members and their deputies coming from different organizations. And it really brings together the Finnish society as a whole. So we have all government ministries, we have the national parliament currently represented by almost all of the political parties in the government. We have Finland's autonomous bodies, we have the Sami parliament and the autonomous Åland Islands and their government represented. And then we have a large number of civil society organizations, the business life, we have research organizations, we have media and culture, we have religious groups represented broadly. So we really like to see this as a kind of mini Finland coming to one place.
Taru, sorry if I just may interrupt you. Do you try, I can only see the first slide still. I don't know whether you try to move forward on the slides.
Oh, I did.
I don't know whether I'm the only one, but I can only see the cover slide.
Okay, then we seem to have a problem because I already did move on. Let's see if I can do something about this.
Mm-hmm.
Like reshare my no, that doesn't help. Let's try again.
Yeah, now I'm on the second slide. Yeah, it moves forward.
And it does still.
Yeah, it still moves. Now you're on the Sustainable Development Strategy 22 to 30
Excellent.
slide.
Yeah, okay, very good. Yeah, because this is pretty much the second slide where I talked through the points. So then we move on to the third one, which is a bit more in depth about the strategy itself. And this we adopted in the Commission in 2022 in March, where actually I was not still working there, but was involved in the process from a different position. And I think this is where the link comes to the GSDR and particularly the 2019 edition, because the idea of making such a strategy, which is based on 6 areas of transformation, was strongly inspired by the national interpretation made by the Finnish expert panel on sustainable development, where they opened up the recommendations of the GSDR 2019 edition, what that means for Finland and how that can influence our sustainability work and Agenda 2030 implementation. And based also on these recommendations, then the National Commission was mandated to draw up a national Agenda 2030 roadmap in 2021. And that was based on a transition management methodology and made through a long and thorough participatory process. And that's how we then ended up having a national strategy for the body that it is not civil society, it is not entirely government, but it incorporates all different kinds of actors. It has no legislative power, but still it can give recommendations, and it does have a role in assessing the way Finland performs with its sustainability work. And then to perhaps have a bit of a look at the areas of transformation inside the strategy, which are 6 of them. Oh yeah, and first the cross-cutting principles, which are fairness, inclusion and participation, leaving no one behind, and then policy coherence, and of course, as an integral part of Agenda 2030 itself, taking global responsibility. And then the 6 areas of transformation. We have the economy and working life, promoting well-being as well as sustainable consumption and production. We have well-being, health and social inclusion. And then we have the food system as a whole, promoting well-being, but also, of course, environmental sustainability of the entire food chain. Then we move on to education, capacities and competencies for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles. And this includes also a strong component of value-based change towards sustainability. Then we have the ecological elements packaged into an area of transformation, including forests and waters and land use, promoting biodiversity and carbon neutrality. And then we have the sustainable energy system as one additional area of transformation. And last, and certainly not least, we then have support for the global implementation of the Agenda 2030, kind of at the basis of the whole strategy constellation. And then, well, this work was done in 2022. It has been a process of starting to actually bring the strategy into life, because each one of the areas of transformation has a vision of where we would want to be in 2030, what that means for Finland. There is a kind of higher level roadmap towards what would need to happen for us to reach that vision and for us to reach those goals. But the strategy itself does not include the actual measures. How do we get there? And this is now a work in progress, being for the current commission, which will work until the end of 2027. And of course, some of the activities will probably last longer than the kind of the end of the current commission's term. And this is a process now being facilitated from the commission secretariat, which means Eva and myself, to kind of build an implementation plan for the strategy. And the basic elements of this plan would be as thematic ones. There's governance, then there are capacities for sustainable development, and then there's an element on values as a driver of sustainability transformation. And then we have so far developed kind of 4 elements for the implementation plan, which are then visualizing and identifying gaps and obstacles for systemic change. This means more specifically, particularly legislation, for example. We can look at a certain area of transformation or a phenomenon or a change inside one of the areas of transformation and start thinking how different pieces of legislation coming from the EU or from international agreements or from the national level, how do those play together? How do they either facilitate or impede the kind of developments that we want to see happening? And then we have the Commission as an agent for enhancing capacities. We have quite a lot of actors who play a role either inside of formal or informal education or kind of activities that can in many ways improve the sustainability capacities for people working, for youth, for children, for all groups of ages of people. Then we have participation and inclusion, which is a very key element of the Commission as such, as a body. And then we have an element of activities that would promote either one of the areas of change inside the strategy or something else identified as very key to change the way things in Finland are going or how we act as part of the global community. And this, in brief, would then be the kind of my 2 cents for this discussion. And I hope that Eva will then complement whatever I said coming from her own point of view with the much wisdom that she has, being a very experienced worker in this sphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taru. Mayor, just as mentioned by Taru, can I invite Dr. Eva Fuhrman for maybe complementing and linking it to the lessons learned from the GSTR. Eva, the floor is yours.
So would you like me to
Yes.
give my introduction here before Parfait?
Yes, I think I just changed the order because it's you may also just reflect on Finland, and then Parfait can close the session or move on to reflect maybe on both.
Yeah, that's a good idea, and I'll just put my watch running so
if you're ready.
Okay, yeah, so I don't have any slides, and I think Taru extremely well described the process, and I'm trying to build the part that has happened between the GSTR work that I was part of at that time. As I was working at the Research Institute, the Finnish Environment Institute, and now I'm working at the Prime Minister's office. So in a way, one of the steps from GSTR to the kind of practical work that we are doing with Taru is also part of the implementation of the GSTR in Finland. But that was my personal choice and the one who then elected me to this position. Anyway, so I would just like firstly to say I really enjoyed Astra's and Shirin's introductions to the reports as such, but just to say also that from the perspective of implementing the SDGs is that actually it's often thought that if you approach through these areas of transformation, the systemic thing, that you somehow give up the SDGs. But in reality, what it actually means is that we are able to accelerate the SDGs through the systems. So it's nothing to be afraid of that you somehow give up the SDGs if you use the systems approach. And the systems approach is also really nice because it brings different actors together, which actually naturally are often working together, but it also helps people from different sectors to come and work together better than before, like from the business sector with the government and with the communities, the localization at the moment, really big thing, also getting part of it together with actually the policymakers, for example. It's seen quite often that even though government is often seen to lose power because we have more other actors, it's extremely important that the government is so-called orchestrating all of it and supporting it with the work on policies and governance as a whole. And science plays an extremely important role because when we are dealing with complex and complicated issues and with the systems approaches, it's really good to have actually the tools from the science to support. So the best thing is actually to work together with the science community. It was really nice to see in Cameroon where Dr. Sidon and Parfait, Dr. Parfait have been definitely working closely together, and that's what we do also in Finland, as Taru already explained. The S-curve that came then in the 23 report has also been really important, that we do understand that this is not only a beautiful story, that we really need to work hard. Our secretary generals said that actually it's not enough that the leaders of the ministries say that, yes, this is important. It's hard work for them as well, really, to do something on this. And then, of course, capacity building is crucial, as is mentioned in the 23 report, that actually what kind of skills we need in the future depends very much what kind of future we want. It's not the only one story that we need. Everyone says we need the digitalization, but in reality, we need much broader society, and really think that if we want sustainability, then the skills that are needed are quite different from people who only want development that might be highly risky to our societies and to the planet as well. So what helps then in implementing these GSDR reports? I already mentioned the fact that it's really crucial that the science is heard, it's taken seriously, but it's also taken as a party, as a collaborator. We are on the same side, science and policy and business and local level. We are all together. So it's more to find the right way to work together. So that's definitely one way of doing that. And in Finland, for example, here, the crucial thing has been having a science panel for sustainable development that actually moved 2 years ago to be still independent, but as part of the Prime Minister's office. So they have very much actually implemented and also somehow translated the Global Sustainable Development Report to our practical situation in Finland. What do we need from the report? What helps us from that report? And when we talk in the Global Sustainable Development Report of the 6 transformative areas, they could be different in different countries, as many have done as well. Germany has their own, and Cameroon has probably also brought up their own issues when you analyze it. Something that was still very crucial when we were writing the report was the economic part, and that is one very crucial one. But I would also like to say and stress that people who are working in the administration have really hard time, because they need to do the today's work, they need to do the incremental development, and they also need to get inspired and find time to do this radical transformation. And this needs very strong leadership from in the ministries. I would just like to stop in a couple of things, saying that it's really important that we give a picture that the future can be positive in the future, but we need to make major changes, that there is no black future. Secondly, it's really important that we try this transformation and we make this understanding that it's not difficult. It's possible to do it, and it actually makes things easier if we integrate it into our practices. And the third one is that we really need to start to learn future thinking, that we don't close it out because it's difficult. We need to think it with our eyes open. Then we need the media literacy. We are going the wrong direction because we don't have that. And finally, this issue of economic growth. I don't say we don't need, in some countries we do need economic growth, but it's definitely not the core. We need many other things, and this also requires new kind of ways how we follow how we build our budgets and how we also follow the development in our countries. So I stop here, and I don't have anything to add, because what Taru said is actually following from the report of the expert panel or the science panel that we have on on sustainable development. And that's in collaboration of these two bodies, and of course many others, but definitely these two bodies, the collaboration was very crucial. So thank you. This was all from my side.
Thank you, Eva, very much. This is very helpful. And I see the two experiences also from Cameroon and Finland, where the cooperation between the science community and the government planning ministries are hand in hand makes a big difference. Now, can I pass back to Dr. Parfait Elondou on the final reflection and further lessons learned? How can this be integrated into national planning? Dr. Parfait.
Parfait, unmute.
Unmute.
I think Eva has done a little bit of the work in talking about things that I wanted to address. And so I will simply say a couple of things for reinforcement. And this is also work that we are doing with Dr. Saidu and Dr. Belong and the Minister of Planning. And so first, as a preamble, I'd say, again, for anybody who hasn't read the report from cover to cover, please do, because the report is really chock full of useful information. If you read the report and with understanding, I would say it's almost half a PhD. And so there's a need to follow up both in academia and in the world of policy. In the world of academia, it stands to transform the way we think about research and how we analyze development issues. And I've been trying to do a bit of that follow-up at Cornell. I teach a class in development based on the Sustainable Development Report. Here in Korea, I'm here because I got invited to do the same thing, teach a course on global development on the basis of the Sustainable Development Report. I have similar things that I'm doing with partners in China, even if it's remotely. So there's a lot of work to be done. And there's actually a lot of transformation that need to be in the way students are trained, not just radical transdisciplinarity, but also developing new methodologies. Now, for the field and for the world of policy, I think one of the key messages that keeps coming is systems approach and transformation. And so Dr. Saidu and his boss, the Minister of Planning in Cameroon, tasked us to thinking about how we can transform the food system. The food system is actually one of the main entry points in both GSDR 2019 and 2023. And so we produced a report that I'm going to share, really the broad outlines. And so how do you plan to change the system to make it more food secure? And so we devised a strategy, or we're in the process of devising a strategy that rests on 4 pillars. The first being, and the acronym is SMIG, S for a systems approach, M for multi-resilience, I for inclusion, and G is gradual transformation. And I'll take you quickly through those 4 pillars. System transformation is just to think about food security from a systems approach, not just focus on agricultural production, because as we know, there's a lot of losses and waste happening at all the nodes. And so you have to think about the integrity of the entire system and what are the weak points and how to make each of the weak points stronger and make the entire system more resilient. And so we are building on this and trying to quantify where the holes and the gaps are. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about being resilient. And so you have to plan in the context in which you expect recurrent crises, and recurrent crises of different types: environmental crisis, health crisis, economic crisis, and political crisis. And so each of these crises, it turns out, has a primary node of impact. I mean, they can affect multiple nodes, but if you think about them, there's kind of a correspondence between different points in the food system and different crises. Environmental crises are most damaging at the production stage. Economic crises are most damaging at the food access to the poor. Health crises are more impactful in the sense that they divert resources that would go to assist poor families, and so they affect social distribution of food. And then political crises can affect the transportation of goods and services and access to implants. So you have to kind of integrate the food system and make it ready and nimble to address all of these crises, hence the notion of multi-resilience. But multi-resilience also means being able to address this crisis at different points of the crisis, before, during, and after. And before, we want to build early warning systems. And so we are in the process of trying to build a matrix of different approaches, building on the experiences of the country itself, but also best practices elsewhere, in addition to traditional practices, traditional knowledge that has helped farmers anticipate episodes of bad weather, et cetera, et cetera. So this matrix is actually being gradually constructed. And the Minister of Planning is convening a conference that is going to bring together all the countries in Central African region. And hopefully we get a chance to share that broader perspective and that framework to think about the transformation of a food system in a way that is going to make it more resilient. I'll start there.
Thank you, Parfait. Now, looking at the time, we have 9:34. I think I will pass back to to Stephanie for the next session. Thank you, everyone, for the very informative discourse about the GSTR and how this can be integrated into national planning processes. Stephanie, it's back to you.
Thank you so much, Jürgen, and thank you, colleagues from Cameroon and Finland. I have to say, it's really exciting to see the GSDR being used in a tangible way in national processes as, you know, part of the team creating the GSDR over the last 8 years. It's very gratifying to see how it's being used, and it goes beyond just the pages in the report, but actually is a useful tool. And that's sort of the whole purpose of the report as a science policy interface tool and resource for governments. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences and reminding us that all of this work is worthwhile. And similarly, we are now going to turn to the UN system. As Astra said in the beginning, there's been really inspiring collaboration among UN system sister agencies, because this systems thinking is really kind of taken over the approaches of all of the UN system, and especially organizations that are working in country at the national level, supporting governments. And we in DESA we don't have a country presence, but we're working very closely with our colleagues who do, with UNDP and the Development Coordination Office. And we're thrilled to be part of a team moving these ideas forward in a concrete and useful way. And so I'd like to start the conversation with UNDP and the SDG Push initiative, which is so important and very timely, sort of being rolled out as these ideas are being developed. So we're very glad that Laurel is here, and I'll start with Ms. Laurel Patterson from UNDP. So over to you, Laurel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. So I'm joined, and we'll sort of talk together, myself and Alka Bhatia, who's also, I know Stephanie you'll introduce, but just to say, the head of the UNDP office in Namibia, and one of our real leaders and champions in taking the SDG Push work forward. And we really felt it was important that we're sort of presenting and talking about this together, so colleagues get a sense of the theory and the ideas behind this, but also where it practically lands and how it can be useful in decision making. And although it comes in the segment that just follows, I'm also joined with Babatunde, who's here, who's going to be talking about Power of Data when that comes up. But it's just to say, for us, the key around integration is also integrating the integrators. You know, I think it aligns really well with the quintet of change. But of course, for us, the question is always, How can our futurists, how can our foresight experts talk with our data experts and our data scientists? How do we land this in a country? And frankly, even those different sort of disciplines, they often have their own language, their own way of thinking about these challenges. So a big part of our work is to say, how do we draw together, you know, the various facets and drivers of these systems approaches? So what I wanted to share, I was in a session with Astra yesterday. It was Science Day at HOPF, and I thought it was really encouraging, a reflection that she made, which was that the GSDR from 2019 through to 2023, it has really deepened from a scientific and research foundation, and it has especially given us a lot more evidence on the interlinkages. And that's definitely where we pick up our work as well too, and I think it's so important. Related to that, another feature of our work, and I'll show you some of this in a minute, is then asking the question, okay, so we understand the interlinkages, we understand interactions that are positive and that also create challenges or trade-offs. But then what does one do with all of that? So now I know, but I still have to do something. I'm still in a challenging political context. I might be in a challenging economic context. I probably don't have the resources that I need to enact any of these transitions fully in the way that I would want to. So what do I do then? And what I think is really important, I wouldn't say that we have it figured out, but definitely what we're working towards is how do we get from these cloud problems, systems, interdisciplinary understandings to precision in terms of the entry points that can then unlock progress across multiple fronts. Because we can't act everywhere all the time, even if we know that these interactions are fundamental. So what's the precision in the landing point? And that has to be driven by context. That's driven by local partners, right? That's not something that sort of global frames provide for us. And so what's been really important for us in the work that we did last year was our first launch, was to work with 100 countries through a process that we've called SDG Push to identify where those opportunities are in their context. Bring the best of data, know that we'll never have enough. Bring the best of machine learning to understand national priorities, know that that's not the only driver. And then try to plot this very, very practically with interlinkages and opportunity spaces that are based on science, but there's no algorithm, we feel, or at least not yet, for determining what would be the most important at a particular point in time in a country. That requires humans, and it requires different constituents of humans, different sorts of stakeholders that are looking at this from different perspectives. And here, what I think is so important, I mean, UNITAR and UNDESA are bringing us together in these spaces, is we have to be humble, right? We have to be curious. We need to be aware that not any one of us has the full puzzle, the full story. So how do we convene in such a way that we can unlock some of this? So again, I wanted to give you that overview just to sort of share immediately how these different elements of data and digital with generative dialogue, with futures, with foresight, we have to find the ways to connect those and make it meaningful, right? So that it can be picked up, it can be led, and it can be acted upon where it matters the most, which is not with us in headquarters, even though sometimes, you know, these things can work that way. So I'm putting a couple of ideas in the chat, and really it's going to be from Alka that you'll hear the experience of Namibia, and you can click through some of these. But what I wanted to just show you very briefly is just to give you sort of a visual on what the way that we've been thinking about our work. And I think one of the important things to say, I know Babatunde might cover this a little bit later too, is that for us, the visual is very important because it's hard to hold attention these days, right? And so we're looking for ways that we can take complicated information and bring it together visually that allows people that that come from different disciplines, different backgrounds, that they can inquire into it together. They can ask questions. It lights something up. It ignites ideas for them, and it moves us forward. And so one of the things in the documents that I shared is we said, let's start with the foundations and the evidence of progress on the SDGs so far. So we brought all of the data from UN Stats as it's reported from countries into a space where we could look at it not goal by goal, but across the 5 Ps. And what you see reflected here is in fact progress at the target level. And we felt, you know, sometimes we hear this from the peace building tradition. First, you need to complicate so that you can find the precision in terms of your actions. So we have taken all the work best we can and really tried to drive an understanding of interactions and so on, just like, of course, SDGR is the global lead on this at the target level. So this gives us an overview, and the gray bars are quite important for us. I know those aren't always shown in the way we talk about SDG progress, but that's where we don't have data. And again, it doesn't mean that data doesn't exist. It means that it's not reported on. So this opens up a conversation space with us and countries. Are we seeing this the same way? Are we missing anything? Is there more that should be reflected here so that we get the best understanding of foundations? And then, as DSG and many others also say, we want to avoid analysis paralysis. So that's good, but not enough for decision making. And so what we built was a custom machinery capability so that we could upload national documents, which a government decides what they would like us to upload. And it provides an immediate analysis of the most resonant goals of the SDGs. And that helps us for countries that don't mention SDGs in their national priorities, that have these documents in different languages, no problem. We take them in the language that they're written, and you can do all of this right now. The links are in the chat, and get a resonance. With the bigger the bubble, the more resonant that particular goal with the content of the national priority documents, whichever those are. You can do it with VNRs, you can do it with cooperation frameworks, you can do it with vision documents nationally or locally. So again, this is another point where we stop and have a discussion, look at this together. Is there an alignment between those last mile challenges and the areas of national priority? Are the national priorities capitalizing on the areas with the fastest growth? Is there anything that this tells us about the way that we could be more precise or impactful in the way we're making policy choices? And then we map it. So again, this isn't an interlinkage map that we came up with. This is from the EU, the KNOW, K-N-O-W, KNOW SDGs, which looks at the science foundations for the interactions between different SDG targets. Our addition to that is for every country that we're working with, we color-coded the target against the SDG trends. And we invited countries, start with the areas where you have national priorities already. For most of us that work in large bureaucracies, the best indication of what we're going to do next is what we're already doing. It doesn't change that quickly. So let's start with where the investments are happening already. Let's look what the progress data is telling us about SDG achievement and try then to identify, which humans do. So again, no algorithm for this part. Where could we really have an outsized impact? And when we started this, I know Alka will come into the details for now. Maybe this is more of a global overview. Decent work came up over and over again. And you might say, like we did, first of all, that's not surprising. And frankly, it's not that interesting. It's not necessarily an SDG proposition. Jobs can take you in any direction. It doesn't mean it's taking you to an equitable or a sustainable future. So we said to our partners when we were working on this, what would make this truly an SDG proposition? How would you know that the way you're leading decent work is activating, right, progress in these different areas? And countries identified these themselves. This is what comes up over and over again. They said, I'll know that my work is truly decent. It's truly driving the future that we want to see, because I'll start to see numbers move on youth empowerment. I'll start to see numbers move on women's economic empowerment. I'll start to see shifts in the inclusiveness of my society. And again, we're encouraging, you know, our partners and stakeholders that come from many different perspectives to look at this agenda across any one particular goal and find alliances, right? So we need progress with those that are leading in youth empowerment, because that's what's going to tell us that our work in decent jobs is actually having the effect that we need it to have. Same thing, it wouldn't surprise you, and this is a goal 16 moment, that 16.6 on effective institutions came up over and over again. But again, this is not new, and most of you would say we already know this, that governance is such an important driver. Yes. So what could make the way we approach effective institutions truly an SDG proposition? And the poorest countries, those in the lowest income category, they were the ones that said to us, I'll know my institutions are effective when I have fair economic foundations, 8.1. And many countries, almost all in this group, said, I'll know I have effective institutions when I see it show up in health services and education services delivery, public services overall. That's how I'll know that my institutions are truly effective. So again, we hope that this starts to encourage a different way of looking at targets. It's still the precision of acting in governance, but the way we think about its impact then could start to then cut across ministries, interest groups, and SDGs. I won't go through the rest. You probably get the point, I hope, but these were some of the others that came up for us. Our feeling really here was that it's important to identify these opportunity spaces and use the best, just like GSDR does, right, to really help us be precise and have the most impact. But also one of the things that GSDR points out to us is understanding the trade-offs and the barriers is just as important. In some cases, GSDR is talking about that it can be more important than the opportunity space. So we tried very much to look clear-eyed, and we're continuing this work this year to say what's holding us back. What does the economic growth trajectory look like in this particular country? How inclusive is that growth pathway? How carbon intensive is that growth pathway? Are we growing in towards that future or not? And you won't be surprised that last year when we worked with about 100 countries on this, the majority are on growth pathways that are carbon intensive, and that is going up. That's a percentage going up. And from an inclusiveness in terms of poverty levels, there's a lot of stagnancy and reversals. There's not a lot of growth. So it's telling us that the way that we're growing is not in line with our aspirations for the planet or for people. So this is just to share. We feel it's really important for all the conversations we're having on SDGs, whether that's globally or at national or local levels. We need both parts of this story. It's not enough to see where the opportunities are if we can't tackle the barriers and have the conversations and the political influence that we need to have around financing, around quality of growth, et cetera. And again, all of these things that we're developing are really meant to be nationally led and owned. So we're not pretending that we know more. We're not suggesting that the data is complete, that AI or anything else tells us what we should do. But our perspective is that at a moment like this, we need to do the best we can. We need to bring together all of these imperfect parts and ask ourselves, when we look at it together, does it help us drive forward better decision-making, better policies, and a better use, fundamentally, of the 2030 agenda? So I'll stop here. You have the links, and Stephanie, over to you and really to Alka. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Laurel. That's really, really exciting to see the kinds of tools that you are developing and that have been used at the national level. And as you say, the visuals are so important, and it seems like very interactive and things that a lot of our listeners can probably use and explore. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'd like to, as you said, turn the floor over to Ms. Alka Bhatia, who's the resident representative of Namibia, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and to Laurel for this opportunity, and greetings to everybody. I don't know, we are all in different time zones here. So greetings from Namibia, which is also called the land of the brave. And in their bravery, they actually took that bold step of going and trying to work with the SDG push, the tool which has been developed by UNDP. I think they were one of the first countries to kind of start to experiment and see where it takes them. So a huge thanks to the National Planning Commission in Namibia, which really wanted to go this way. And so therefore, let me just start with a quote from the National Planning Commission, because for them, the SDG push, and I quote, demonstrated that we need a big push to 2030, requiring strong policy action to advance our development agenda. Everyone agrees. Most importantly, it suggested acceleration pathways for the big push to happen. The formulation of the next National Development Plan will leverage these insights to deliver the change we want for Namibia in the next 5 years. So end of their quote. And as we speak, they are in the process of actually formulating the next National Development Plan, and they would be looking at the insights or findings which came through the SDG push, which Laurel has very aptly described. It's about machine learning. It's about using our computable general equilibrium models to come up with even to some statistics and with some numbers. They may not be exact, accurate, but I think they do give us a very good idea in terms of what policy combination or what policy options would lead us where. So the SDG push, and particularly I think here where the science comes in through the GSTR and with instruments like or tools like the SDG push, where the world is at a tipping point basically, and where fiscal spaces need ambitious commitments to accelerate the pace of SDGs. And we need an approach which is grounded in systems, in science, and in policy coherence. So all of these, the SDG push tries to get through. It is, and I think for countries to have these insights, because that is the other thing which has been developed by UNDP globally, is over 100 countries SDG Insight Report. And this could be in the lead up to the Summit of the Future. It's imperative that our acceleration agendas fully harness these tools and methods of innovation, emerging technology, and inclusive finance as well, if we want to achieve a real progress. So it was very impressive also listening to the examples from Cameroon and particularly Finland. I think that's something we need to learn more of in the way that has been steered. The whole sustainable development agenda is being steered. So as we said, the SDG push also, and I'm picking up from the first presentation from Shireen, where you mentioned those 3 stages of transformation. Actually, the SDG push is also taking us through those 3 stages of transformation, where you sort of unlearn siloed, unsustainable approaches of the past and pick up the more sustainable approaches, bringing together the systems thinking perspective, and because that is kind of needed, and with a generous dose of investment also in the right areas, so that your development trajectory in a country is elevated to the next level, before it kind of stabilizes. And I think it's time, rather than just focus on a lot of the jargon or these kind of things, how do we sort of break it down into smaller bite-sized pieces for countries to implement? And I think this is where the SDG push is showing us the way. It comes up with those policy options. It gives you the scenarios in the business as usual. It gives you 2-3 other policy options which are coming, and then the optimal policy option which needs to come through. So if we take the case of Namibia, for instance, and let me also say, somebody had already mentioned, and I think Laurel as well, because in some of the countries, most of the developing countries, we don't really have data. Even if I was just looking at the GSDR, the findings for Namibia, a lot of the data is still old. There's also a problem where the countries are not updating the data. There's also a problem where they don't have the data, or where they are not aware how the data should be done. So tools like the SDG push then rely on modeling to even cover up those data gaps and come up with recommendations. So the SDG push uses digital data innovation and science and systems thinking, so to connect the dots and rethink our development trajectories on how we do development. So as I said, taking the example of Namibia, by using innovation, and systems thinking, the SDG push zoomed in on patterns and interlinkages around the SDG systems in a very contextualized manner relating to the national context. So, for instance, in Namibia, we came up with a development policy paradigm, through an inclusive growth and investment scenario. So how do you unlock, how does the country unlock these policy combinations across multiple and at times conflicting priorities and goals? So where are the trade-offs? What do we need to do? So, but a government then takes a conscious decision in coming up with these policies. And likewise, as I said, it's about systems thinking. So it's not only about economic growth and development. I think somebody said it is not only always about economic growth. Very true. Because if you ignore the human capital development aspect, you cannot really get the results you are thinking in a purely economic model. So inclusive growth model with a generous investment, backed up by generous investment, or the optimal levels of investment. In Namibia's case, it is only about 10% of the investment hike in some of the productive sectors, coupled with obviously targeted social protection, so that you do take care of the most vulnerable or those being left behind, while also adopting a life cycle approach on skills development, the transitions in skills that is really needed, where most of the developing countries are having these challenges in kind of keeping pace with a very fast changing dynamic world. So how do we ensure this life cycle approach for skills development with regard to also in cases of universal health, and also environmental sustainability. And all of this has to be supported by a very strong foundation of governance in terms of enhanced service delivery, where not only from the public sector, but also how do we bring in the private sector also to be more engaged in providing these services to citizens? How do we hear the citizens' voices as well? So these are some of the scenarios which have come forward. And I think at least in Namibia, the Planning Commission is very much in step. In fact, they were part and parcel of this entire process. As Laurel mentioned, we like to ground it very nationally so that there is an uptake. It is not something, okay, that we in the UN actually, it's also about, we are very supply driven actually over here. We have a number of tools, options to do, and sometimes we end up confusing our governments as well as to what you should have, what you should not have. So there are different kinds of models, etc. But for me, I think the most practical one is what would work, and where there is also a willingness to do that. So with this, also with SDG push, I think Namibia will be able to support the advocacy around a very refocused roadmap for 2030. Namibia is also the co-facilitator of the Summit of the Future. So even with their example, I think they could really make a case in terms of how we harness both systems thinking and science, as well as bring in policy coherence, to zero in on some of these national accelerators. So just to conclude, it's also we all recognize that there is no one policy or one organization or one country. I mean, I would love that Finland was replicated across the world. We'd be very much be able to achieve the 2030 agenda by that year, and not go up even beyond 2050, as was mentioned. But the SDG push is also about that. It's about combining the tools, the cooperation, and the innovation for a system that is fit for the future. So let me pause here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Resrat Batiev. So nice to hear that. Really important to remember why we're doing all this. It's to help the countries, and I think that your perspective from Namibia is really, really valuable. We are running a little short on time, so I'm going to go right into the next session. And if I could ask everyone to try to keep to that sort of 4 or 5 minute mark, that would be great. I have bargained with our organizer, and we have 10 extra minutes. So I hope that people can stay on for an additional 10 minutes. And I'm sorry for those of you in other time zones where that gets even later than it already is. But thank you so much for your patience. And I'd like to turn it over. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the high impact initiatives that were featured in the SDG Summit last year, and 2 of them in particular. And for the first one, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Babatunde Adebayo on the power of data. So Babatunde, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, and thanks everyone. It's good to talk about the power of data today. So as Stephanie said, it's one of the high impact initiatives for the UN that was launched last year during the SDG Summit. There were 12 of them. And on the data side, as you can see from what Aka was saying earlier and many of the comments from the different colleagues, data is important, and we talk a lot, and it's either we like it or we don't like it, or we say, there's no data, or there's too much data. But then from the SDG data report, for instance, we've seen, as Laura was saying earlier, there's a lot of gaps in the SDG data monitoring, right? So the question is, how do we fix that, and how do we work together in order to be able to generate the kind of data that we need, right? And most importantly, be able to connect the dots between the data generators and the policymakers that are needing this data for the different SDG acceleration initiatives that is out there. So that's a big part of the Power of Data initiative, and it's co-led by UNFPA, UNICEF, World Bank, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and also the Committee of Chief Statisticians of the UN system with us in UNDP. The Power of Data, there was a big launch last year during the SDG Summit with the private sector and the different governments with 15 countries that signed up at that launch. And I'll put in the chat in a minute the link that you can be able to see all the different countries that signed up for this. And then since then, it's been different engagements. I just put in the link, different engagements with the governments, right? So for the 15 countries, we've done some analysis of where they are on the data and the data readiness of some sort. You'll see it on the link that I just shared. But most importantly, there's been a national high-level partnership workshops that have been carried out in about 10 of these countries. And these workshops ranges from bringing the different partners together in the country in order to understand, the kind of data that is needed, what is needed in order to generate the new data, and how do we engage the private sector effectively, right, in this area, and how do we bring the whole UN system together to support the data gaps that we've seen in different ways. So you look at the link that I sent, one of the things that was very interesting, and we've quoted this a lot, is talking about the power of data, is that data is the fuel that powers different progress across all the transitions, right? So we've talked a lot about transitions today and the SDG acceleration, and there's the research by Delberg that talks about the $32 for every dollar invested in data systems. You can take that number, you can say it's high enough or low enough, but it tells us that data and analytics in different ways are critical, right, for a lot of the unlocking a lot of the potential on the GSDR and the SDG push work that we're doing. The center of this, the power of data, as I was saying earlier, is the partnership, right? And the partnership on data generation and usage. It's very, very critical one of the commitments from the SDG Summit political declaration last year was that there will be political support for generation of the data. So we need to continue to get partnership within the countries to increase investments in this area, but most importantly, also to bring the different data players together. So that's what we're doing in the 15 countries so far. There has been more countries also that have indicated interest since then, and we continue to encourage that. Please reach out. I know many of the colleagues here, you work in the different countries that maybe it's not part of the 15 countries now. And our goal is to get to 100, 150 countries that will be part of this. We have some generous contribution from the FCDO and the UK government on this, and we continue to work with different partners and donors to encourage to get additional funding, especially at the national level, because this is supposed to be something that that happens at national level and helps us all together to unleash that power of data at the national level. So just as I know we're running out of time, in the 15 countries, we need all of you at the UNCT to work with us to help us to bring all the different partners together. It's co-led by us with UNICEF and World Bank and GPSD, but we need the whole of the system to be able to get everybody on the same, to bring the needs to the table. And then for the countries that are not yet part of it, please reach out to us and our partners, and we have very, very simple ways of signing up. So encourage your government partners to be part of this. Thanks again, and happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much, Babatunde. That's excellent. It seems that all conversations about SDGs sort of start and end with data. So it's really exciting to hear about an initiative that's strengthening that infrastructure. Right over to Ms. Doreen Lynn Robinson, who will be representing UNEP's Nature Driving Economic Transformation. Over to you, Doreen.
Thank you so much. And I've entirely just changed what I was going to do in the spirit of time. So nature driving economic transformation really is the SDG push that falls in that space that I think Shireen started with, the global environmental commons. This idea that nature and natural resources underpin everything about sustainable development. And so this idea is about and this high impact initiative about really getting out of the environment space, but into the economic, social decision-making space, and looking for what are those economic policies that are undermining a sustainable natural base, sustainable development goals. I had a whole bunch of statistics, but I imagine I'd be preaching to the choir, so I'm going to skip those and just say we have 20 countries we're actually pushing, because we're really not looking for tinkering on the margins. We're looking for truly, truly economic transformation. So our aspiration is to have 20 critical countries that are going to pull other countries along. Brazil and Indonesia are our first countries. And Brazil, the example there is really about redefining what a biodiversity economy means for the country. So there's 12 ministries that are basically coming together. If you ask biodiversity economy, even in the UN system, you ask what bioeconomy is, FAO is going to give you a definition, UNEP's going to give you a definition, UNDP. The same thing is happening in ministries. So 12 ministries are coming together to find this policy for the country to stimulate investment that is truly ecologically, socially, and economically sustainable, but is in driving achievement of sustainable development goals. So I'm just going to talk about 4 things that we've learned in applying this systems push approach with some of these countries. And we've done it in other places, not under this initiative, but we're already learning some early lessons. And the first one I want to say is about the word transformation. We all know this, but we don't think about it in our UN processes. Transformation is a neutral term. Everyone assumes transformation is good, but what we're finding, there is a lot of folks who are resisting transformation because there are very significant entrenched invested interests, and data alone is not going to convince them. So taking the time early in the initiative to actually define who and what is being transformed towards what end, for what specific goals. You'd be surprised how quickly, when you start to unpack that conversation, you realize people aren't talking about the same thing at all, and we spend a lot of time going in circles. So that's one key. The other thing is really having a process in place for managing those vested interests who are probably quite powerful and don't want to push that transformation. And that is particularly in these socially and politically mediated contexts, having an actual systems-based process to do that matters. The second point about the systems approach is to not be naive. I'm a systems ecologist by training. But systems approaches are not common in the scientific community. So to think they're going to be common in the policymaking community is probably quite naive. And so we have a long way to go to figure out how to roll them out. And what we're learning is defining boundaries within this nature-driving economic transformation is so important. If we don't define the boundaries of the system really aren't in terms of figuring out what that economic policy is, we're losing a lot of ground. And what we've learned in at least 3 of our initial country conversations is those boundaries are very much about political economy and timeframes. Depending on which institutions are really supporting the transformations we're pushing for, and what that means for things like elections looming, we are not defining our boundaries appropriately to get to the change we want. So having a boundary defining process and then looking at the leadership of the institutions and having some contingency planning for how far we can go in our policy transformation pathway has been critically important. The third point I want to say is about science. We have found that when you're bringing the multi-sectoral communities together on this, being sure that you have a balance of power of the different sciences participating in the dialogue. What we found is if we have too many of one kind of sector and one kind of science playing out in this process, it undermines this truly intersectoral approach, because what we get is scientists within the same discipline fighting within their discipline about the science and the data and the details and missing the intersectoral connection points. So being really purposeful in these processes, how to manage those processes and making sure the stakeholders have been at the table. And what we've learned the hard way is that the behavioral and social science aspects of systems transformation are often underlooked for other aspects of science. So we're looking right now, how do we balance that going forward with other countries? The point about data we're learning, particularly in nature driving economic transformation, is that lag times, periodicity, capacity to collect the data, and ownership of the data undermines the process of system transformation. If the data is all coming, as we know, from the global north, then trying to transform something at a country level involves a lot more investments in trust building and such as part of the systems process to roll this out to get to your endpoint in policy. And then the last point I want to make it, and it really struck a chord with me, what Elke said about we can often in the UN system be supply driven, not demand driven. And that speaks to the tools that we bring to the table. Tools matter, but often our tools are upstream. Like in our process, we're talking about natural capital accounting, strategic environmental accounts, systems mapping. These are all upstream tools, but we haven't put enough attention into the downstream tools about how do you mediate trade-offs, scenario analysis, those kinds of processes that also have to be framed appropriately culturally and linguistically if we're actually going to mediate this socially mandated process of driving that transformation. And so the tools for framing is where we tend to put a lot of efforts, and they are necessary but insufficient to get to the endpoint of that transformation. And so now we're looking at how do we bring in some of those more downstream and accept, and particularly tools about mediation, trade-off management that are culturally appropriate, and that we can build this toolbox across all of these initiatives so that we can get to that kind of trade-off discussion that we have to get to. So I will leave it at that. I know it was a quick tour of what we're learning, but hopefully helpful. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Doreen. It was very helpful. And I think the idea of really defining the issues, bioeconomy, and then finally rooting the tools and the work in the national and local context, that's so important. We're going to switch up the order just slightly because our GSDR scientist from India, Ambuj, it's getting late. He has another appointment. I'm going to bring Ambuj in now. And then Giovanni, you'll have the nice task of wrapping the entire thing up at the end. So just to prepare you, but Ambuj, over to you for some reflections before we move on to talking more about the UN system at the national level. So Ambuj, over to you.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks for your flexibility, and thanks also for inviting me to this. I'm going to keep it as short as possible. I think I want to just kind of, I'm supposed to talk about capacities, but I want to kind of just step back for a second. And I think we've already seen a lot of the talks already kind of highlight different dimensions of capacity. Whether it's data or whether it's systems approaches, all of that is basically suggesting all of these things are important, and therefore you need capacity to be able to, for example, collect data or take systems approaches. So I think the point that we made in the GSDR 2023 report, let me kind of do the backdrop for us for capacity. Our report suggested that, I think as Shireen already mentioned, that accelerating transformations means taking a more systematic and strategic approach, which is why we presented that S-curve as a kind of a framework to help people think through this process of transformations much more systematically. And those are the three phases that Shireen already mentioned. So I think the point that we made in the report is that similarly, if one is taking a kind of a very systematic approach to understanding and unpacking the transformation process, we also need to take a similarly systematic approach to thinking about capacity. It's not that folks in different agencies don't think about capacities. We've been talking about capacity building for decades already now. So I think the key point to take away from my report is that it's reiterating the importance of capacity and saying that if we are taking a very structured approach to facilitating, shepherding, and accelerating transformations, and you can think of transformations as being in different stages, then you also need to think about capacities to support each of those stages. So the first stage that, for example, Shireen mentioned is the capacity, which is the kind of the emergence phase of the transformation. Getting that phase actually going really requires generating alternatives, but also building some consensus on the strategic direction and foresight, which varies from country to country. For every country, achieving SDGs aligns with different ways and plays out in different ways in the national context. And that understanding that is a very local and national capacity of what is it that you need to support the emergence of that transformation. The second phase is the acceleration phase, which again, Shireen had mentioned, and that requires different kinds of capacities. It requires a capacity to scale up the transformation, coordinate across different kind of actors. Very important, actually, the point that was just mentioned by Doreen, which is about managing conflicts. Because as you actually drive one kind of positive transformation back from existing actors who are going to lose out in the new transformation, example being, as Shireen had mentioned, with the rise of renewable energy, we're getting real pushback from various actors in the fossil fuel space. So that's a second set of capacities that are needed to manage the acceleration phase. And then the third kind of capacity is really kind of institutionalization of the transformation. May require different kind of policies to put in place, legislative reforms, new institutions that facilitate this implementation and really put it in place, enforcing and monitoring, learning from how we are doing and learning how to do better. So, I mean, there really is a very large set of capacities that are needed, but I think I'll just leave it at that. The point is that if one really wants to drive the transformations in an accelerated manner and in an effective manner, that is both relevant to the national context, but also will vary from SDG to SDG. So you really need to do a very, very systematic analysis of the capacity needs across the phases of the transformation for the specific SDG transformation in particular national context, which really means that effectively, if one is talking about capacity building, national efforts at doing that are absolutely key. International partners can absolutely help, but in the end, a lot of the capacity that's needed is national capacity. And so I think we just want to kind of very much put that front and center in our report as one of our key additional contributions building on the 2019 report, which is that as you think about everything else, all the nice ideas that were in the 2019 report, please also don't forget to think about capacity in this systematic fashion as being a centerpiece of how to really accelerate the transformations. And I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Ambuj, thank you so much. Thank you for those important points and sort of putting human capacity and the actors who are actually going to make these changes sort of back at the center of the discussion. And thank you for staying so late. And
thanks.
We appreciate your being here. Now, without further ado, I'd like to come back to the UN system and turn the floor over to Mr. Gonzalo Pizarro from the Development Coordination Office. Gonzalo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I hope you can hear me. Yes, perfect. Let me go straight into it. So we've heard so far the scientific evidence and several experiences indicating us that if we are serious about trying to accelerate SDG achievement, we need to move towards a system approach. We have heard also that we have analytical tools. So the question in my mind is, what is keeping us from actually doing this, right? And so where the rubber hits the road, what needs to change so that we can actually support SDG acceleration at country level? And we have heard some keywords about this in this session, right? We need to focus on the context. And the context means what? Means understanding and really putting forward the fact that each country is unique and the UN support needs to respond to national needs. So these can drive then what are the SDG acceleration pathways that we need to follow at country level. But also, very importantly, we've also heard this from my previous speakers, what are the bottlenecks that need to be removed so that we can actually support unleashing SDG acceleration? So it's not enough to identify the pathway, we need to set the ground for that to take place. And what are the typical bottlenecks that exist across every single, they will be unique to each country, but they will be in the form of lack of capacities, lack of financing, lack of aligning investments, large-scale investments to SDGs, and insufficient regulatory frameworks. So these are areas that we need to work. Now, as a UN system, again, and we've heard, these are areas where we work. These are areas where we have experience. The question then is, are we doing this from a systematic point of view, as my previous speaker was just mentioning? Are we doing it at scale and with the scope that is needed? And I think Alka touched very clearly on this point, right? So one of the key principles of the Agenda 2030 is the integrality of the goals. And I think the systems approach and all what we've heard from our previous panels is that basically a recognition that this has been a missing ingredient in the way that governments, the UN system, civil society, etc., have approached development and have implemented our support to development so far. So the challenge for us as a UN development system is that we need to support these necessary systemic changes at the local, national, regional, and global levels, right? And articulating this is not a trivial matter. So how has this landed from the UN development system side, right? We need to translate the scientific evidence that has been provided to us, the need for acceleration, into concrete programmatic interventions. And here's where the resident coordination system comes into play, right? The RC system is pivotal in facilitating the transition to a systems approach at the country level, guiding a holistic approach to identify what the country's unique SDG acceleration pathway is going to be, using some of the tools that we've that we've heard before, such as the SDG push, right? The UN development system also needs to address those bottlenecks that I was mentioning before that are preventing the SDG acceleration from taking place. The resident coordinators, as the highest ranking representatives of the UN development system in the country, are positioned to drive this type of transformation. They have the mandate to coordinate the UN's efforts that ensure our collective action is greater than the sum of its parts. And here I want to stop 1 second just to mention something that has been hinted or actually explicitly said. The political economy dimension of the transformations cannot be overstated. So understanding who remains to gain and to lose from changing the status quo is key to be able to remove those bottlenecks that are preventing us from unleashing SDG acceleration, right? So what are the instruments that we have to effectively implement the systems approach? So one aspect that was also mentioned several times is that it's crucial to align our strategies as a UN system, our support, to the national priorities. This needs to be driven by the national needs and the national priorities. And the instruments that we have to collect and recognize this is the cooperation framework, which guides our engagement with governments and outlines what our shared objectives and mutual commitments are as a UN system. By aligning our efforts with national development plans, as Alka mentioned also before, we really ensure that our interventions are relevant, impactful, sustainable, and crucially, they need to have national ownership. Another important instrument is the Common Country Assessment, which is a comprehensive analysis of the development landscape in each country and provides us as a system with the evidence base and identifies the key challenges and opportunities and those drivers of change. For example, again, by using multidimensional analysis, such as several of the tools that have been mentioned across, but here is the point. We need to understand which tools are key to respond to the needs of the country and not be supply driven, as it was mentioned before. And it help us understand the systemic issues that need to be addressed to achieve the SDGs at the country level. So in conclusion, accelerating SDG progress at the country level requires us to embrace the systems approach, that's for sure, but it also requires us to align our efforts with the national priorities and ground our strategies in robust analysis. And the DRC system plays a crucial role in this endeavor, providing the leadership and coordination needed to drive systemic change. By working together and leveraging our collective strengths, we can turn our shared vision of sustainable development into reality. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. Thank you for giving that quick but very rich overview of all that the RC system can offer, and it's such an important resource for countries at the national level. Now, you talked about some of the bottlenecks. One was a lack of resources, lack of funding. We're going to turn it now over to the Joint SDG Fund and Marta Kali, who can talk to maybe opening up some of those bottlenecks.
Indeed, Stephanie, thank you so much. Can you hear me well? So just a segue to what Gonzalo was saying, because a lot of the things that he said our RCs and country teams could be doing to support countries in this vision of SDG acceleration can be enabled by the UN Joint SDG Fund, which is for those who don't know the fund, it is a multi-partner trust fund of the United Nations that is really designed to support these highly coordinated and integrated development programs that best respond to national priorities for SDG acceleration. So the mandate of the fund really has integration and system thinking in its DNA, I would say. And it is really about catalyzing investments, catalyzing policy solutions to accelerate progress across multiple SDG at once, in the spirit of what the GSDR presented. as evidence. This also addresses really the member states' demand for coherence, coordination, effectiveness within the UN development system is aligned with the funding compact visions of DSG for a more efficient and effective UN system. So it is really a piece of the UN reform. It is about the UN coming together at its best. It is about empowering resident coordinators to rally UN country teams and partners writ large for greater impact, to advance the policy shift, to forge the partnerships, to build those pipelines of initiatives that Gonzalo was referring to, and to take them to scale with scaling up of capacities that also our expert was saying before, scale up capacities at national and subnational level. So since its establishment, the resident coordinators helped, and this is an aggregated data, of course, 119 country teams access to 168 million in financial commitments from the Joint SDG Fund for joint programs with 31 entities. But this year, about 100 million were really allocated to what the UN SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Group has identified the key entry points, based also on the evidence of the GSDR, to digital transformation, decent jobs and universal social protection, food system transformation, SDG localization, and just energy transition, with a focus on gender equality, human rights, youth empowerment, and localization. So let me say just a couple of words of what is the value proposition of the fund for the discussion that we had today, for these transformations or transitions. As a vehicle to really orchestrate, as a vehicle for the UN to orchestrate this swift and system-wide actions to achieve these transitions. This is the key really value proposition. It is about unlocking resources, public and private, to accelerate the SDGs through these entry points that have been identified. So we have applied our own formula based on this evidence to the way in which joint programs are designed. And they need to meet the criteria of integration that has been emphasized throughout, really breaking the silos, speed in terms of accelerating progress towards the SDGs and reducing the time to reach concrete targets. Scale, so there needs to be this catalytic element which we refer to, and we're actually looking at the financial leverage of at least 1, 2, 3 or more as we reach millions of people. Sustainability of capacities as well, and context specificity, the tailoring to the context and that everybody has referred to, of course. So in sum, really the program tracks of the Joint SDG Fund are designed to enhance this transformation, enhance this enhance integration across this transformation, ensure these synergies, reduce the trade-offs. For instance, the work on food system transformation is closely linked to advancing decent jobs, social protection, environmental sustainability, while also using digital technology as an instrument. And this is illustrated in a lot of our programs that I would be happy to share specific examples in another form, because obviously there's no time to go into, and it wouldn't do justice to the detail of how this really happens in specific country example. But there is this element of financial leverage that I want to go back to before perhaps I mention 1 or 2 examples. The financial leverage, there is a question that we often get from different audiences, happens in 3 ways. So there is, first of all, the co-funding of joint programs where the fund's programmatic resources are matched by UN entities, governments, and other partners. Then there is the direct support in launching and de-risking innovative financing solution. So unlocking the proceeds from SDG bonds, for instance, and investments in blended facilities as a form of co-financing. And then there is the support for piloting initiatives that can be replicated, can be expanded by governments and other development actors. And so this proof of concept, which then results in scalable opportunities, scalable policy services with demonstrated impact. So this is something that can be exemplified, for instance, by some of the results that we had from 2023, where a lot of the financial leverage stemmed from the fund support for the issuance of SDG thematic bonds in Indonesia, Uzbekistan, Fiji, and Cabo Verde. In Indonesia, for example, the fund supported a joint program that helped the government develop the enabling policies and the SDG impact management systems to issue the country's first sovereign SDG bonds. And the proceeds from the first SDG bond issuance there were 584 million, financed vaccination of 30 million children, scholarships for over 11 million students, and extended digital access to over 2,100 households in rural areas. If we look at some of the other sort of transition, the new joint programs that are being launched, for instance, one on that has an entry point as digital transformation in Colombia. We see how this interplay of different aspects of the transition, the transformational aspect that was described in multiple points of the presentations today. So Colombia is piloting a model for transitioning a local indigenous community towards self-sufficiency for energy, water, and food capacities, but it also has mechanisms to scale that up. So in addition to building capacities, it also creates a governance framework, breaking the silos, and also a sustainable financing model with local authorities, with the private sector and the community. So it's a multi-stakeholder approach matched by the UN system approach, with different opportunity to scale up financing, bringing in, crowding in public and private resources across several of the new programs that were launched. We also offer support to, through the fund, resident coordinators determine how UN entities can best leverage their complementary expertise for this particular joint programs to meet the demands at country level, the needs at country level, and identify and deploy expertise also, if it's not available within the UN development system, to support this intervention. So this is overall a summary of what we're doing, the best response to the priorities that were highlighted today. That really is an effort to promote integration and system thinking with the leadership of resident coordinators on the ground, with a huge variety of partnerships on the ground, and with this leveraging opportunities. So over to you for any questions or follow-up.
Thank you so much, Marta. That's really, it's a great overview of this joint SDG fund, which is doing so much important work, and I think it's just getting started, and it's very exciting to see where your support will take the UN system and all of our partners. So I know that people will have a lot of questions for you. I will say now that the chat will stay open for 15 minutes after our session ends, until 10:55. So if there are questions and sort of conversations that you'd like to have with other participants, feel free to keep using that chat, because I don't think that we will have, unfortunately, time for a Q&A during the session itself. Now, I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Niovani Madisa, who has the unenviable task of wrapping up the entire discussion, which was so wide-ranging and rich. But if anyone can do it, I know Niovani can. For those of you who don't know her, she's the Director of Research for Sustainable Development Policies at the African Institute for Development Policy. And I'm very happy to turn the floor over to Niovani for a concluding presentation. Thank you so much, Niovani.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I am delighted to be the last. It's a difficult thing, so I've had to rearrange my thoughts. But importantly, I have been happy to hear about social development as well, because often when people talk about transformations, especially using the S-curve, the tendency is to think environment, medicine, natural sciences. But there are, lessons that can be learned from how we achieve transformation using, for example, the ESCAV as a tool in education, in gender equality matter. I was interested to hear about the SDG fund and focus on gender equality, human rights, because those are areas where I feel that if anything, there is more requirement for political will and for collective and individual decisions that we are going to change this, and we must make it happen. Yes, it's not going to be easy, but it's a decision that countries as well as communities make. So I'm glad to hear that. Just to give an example, when I was presenting in Malawi the SDG 2023 report, because I wanted to sort of share the report, but also to have a discussion in terms of how this might be used. And I'm glad that we had the National Planning Commission thinking about how it might be used, but we also had scientists and civil society organizations thinking more broadly. And there were the examples that, as one would expect, in terms of how we move from like cutting down trees to use as fuel for cooking to more sustainable systems and fuel. But importantly, there was also thinking about how we are approaching the ending child marriages as an example. And although the process wasn't necessarily, oh, let's follow the SDG 2023 or 2019 report and learn the lessons from there, because the task started way before that, but we were able to sort of like rewrite and say, we can use the systems and the way, we transform in the ending child marriage, because this required, levers such as governance, legislation to ban child marriages, legislation to actually define who is a child, because there were loopholes. If you don't actually specify who is a child, you have, interpretations left, right, and center. But then we also had individual and collective action at community levels, bylaws to interpret the law so that the community could understand, but also individuals taking on the role as champions for ending child marriages. Mostly these were like chiefs who took on these roles. I thought when, saw in newspapers and in television, all these, reports that this marriage has been annulled, or this man has been put in jail, or these parents have been put in jail for allowing their child to marry, I thought that we had reached a tipping point as a community, because now this has become so unacceptable. We want to move. So as we move to, to a tipping point, then essentially the transformation can actually use that momentum and accelerate and go forward, and which is what the GSDR reports actually tell us. So I wanted to finalize by just saying, so yes, we've talked about the transformations, we've talked about examples of how transformations happen. How do we actually make it real in practice? And the GSDR report actually has some recommendations in the, towards the end of the report on how we make this happen. And I'll just list down the 6 things as an ending point of what we suggested as ways of accelerating action. So one of the things we have suggested is that we do need to have national plans for transformative accelerated action. And these platforms need to be inclusive, underpinned by strong science. And, I suggest emphasis mind that, we can also look around and see, do we already have platforms that can actually take on these roles? Maybe we have a very inclusive and collaborative style of doing planning for the country. This could be areas where we can do the national transformation actions. But we do need to identify priorities. And I did hear, I think it was Doreen, about priorities at the country level, because when everything is lagging behind, it's easy to just feel, okay, we'll just move with the momentum, the way things are, etc. but we may need to prioritize and have some things at least that we can tick and say we made progress in A, B, C, and D. And in this process, we need to identify what the impediments to progress are. And I did hear somebody talk, we need to be clear, we know what are the barriers before we actually saying these are the solutions. But a lot of the solutions are already out there. The science, is providing solutions on a daily basis. And on science, I need to emphasize this is used in a broad sense, includes social sciences, humanities, etc. So what are the potential solutions that we can use to address the impediments and to shift these barriers? And then we need to think about what is it that we can use as levers to get to a point where, society has changed, it sees things differently, and it is on the path to acceleration. And then the second thing we talked about is looking at an all-country approach where we're looking at local governments. So not just focusing on national, local governments, we need to embrace and include the private sector, business and industry. We need to also have investors. We need to have civil society to encourage them to see where they can make a difference, what plans they can bring in of their own that could actually help with the acceleration as a country. We also talk about reforming financial systems in both international and domestic. And I think one of the things that we need to emphasize is we can actually make quite a lot within the countries by using, say, the credit companies, the financial systems within the country, as well as, the support that's needed from the global funds. And someone already said about taking advantage of science-based tools and data, because we need to be able to monitor progress. We need to use robust systems and tools so that we know where we're going, how far we've gone, etc. And linked to that is the science policy interface. And the report does really emphasize the need for countries to actually listen to the science and listening to, context-specific local science as well as international. But the local science, we need to encourage countries to have, for example, scientific advisory committees for, governments, for parliament, and for leaders, so that, we can take the best of the solutions and, run with them. And then the final point is about having strong accountability mechanisms. And there we, suggested, not just looking at, data monitoring tools, but also taking advantage of the power of advocacy, civil society organizations, the power of the media, where they can take governments to account to make sure that we are making progress. So I would like to end by saying that I have enjoyed listening to everything we have said, lots and lots of lessons to learn. And it's clear that there's a lot that's happening that some of us may not be aware. I think we don't have an excuse really for not making progress. Funds are becoming available, data are increasingly becoming available. Yes, I agree, in the low-income countries, we still struggle with, say, subnational level data, etc. But we can still, take advantage of what's there. There are a lot of, projections and estimates that still provide, the needed, database. And then, importantly, is the fact that we do have, strong commitment from youth, from, countries. Let's make progress. Let's make SDG 2030 a reality, even if we get to 2050, but let's make some things a reality. I would like to stop there, and I'd like to thank you. Over to you, Stephanie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Nivani. As I suspected, you pulled everything together so beautifully and really, crystallized all of the issues. When you talk about empowering young girls and women and ending child marriage, you can't get any more important and sort of concrete than that. So thank you so much for bringing that example and for sharing all of the recommendations from the report. And indeed, no excuses. We have what we need. We need to just move forward and make progress. Thank you all so much for being part of this session. It really was so rich, so many diverse initiatives and points of view, and I think it really pulled everything together nicely. I'm going to put my email address in the chat because I know that there probably are questions. And like I said, there unfortunately is not time for a real Q&A, but if you have questions that you'd like me to direct to any of the panelists, I can do that. And thank you all so much for participating, and have a wonderful day, evening, and I hope that the rest of HLPF is very fruitful for you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.